Hello and welcome to the virtual classroom. I'm your host, Dr. Olmsted. Today's topic is America at European Contact. Now, before we get started, I'll tell you this every single time you watch a video. Hit pause on your screen right now. And I want you to jot down the lecture outline and pay particular attention to those key terms at the top. Now, those key terms are words that you need to be able to define to the absolute best of your ability. You need to be able to identify the who, the what, the where, the why. Why is this term significant, and how does this term connect to a bigger narrative in U.S. history, or even to other parts of the world? And so what you want to do is hit pause, jot down the outline, jot down those key terms, and then as we're going through this lecture, fill in the blanks below each part of the hierarchy of the outline, and as well as define fully the key terms. And again, it's something you should do at the beginning of every lecture. Now for today, hit pause, jot down the outline, and then hit play again, and we'll get started with our first lecture. You got it? Okay. Now, I don't always do this for every lecture, and hey, maybe I should. But this first lecture, I have two major arguments or themes that I want to highlight right at the beginning. And these two themes are very important questions and arguments that we want to answer through today's lecture. The first is that Europeans did not discover America. No, Europeans did not discover America. Columbus did not discover America. America was already full of inhabitants. It was not a vast, empty, virgin wilderness that needed Europeans to come and save it, discover it, civilize it. It was already inhabited. And then number two, very important as well, there was no such thing as an Indian in 1492. So in 1492, when Columbus sailed the ocean blue, he did not discover America. It already had inhabitants here. And there was no such thing as the people that he found when he got here. There was no such thing as a quote-unquote Indian. It did not exist. And so through today's lecture, we're going to discuss those two major arguments, major themes, and look at more in-depthly why my arguments are correct. Now, let's start at the beginning, though. There is still a lot of argument to be had about how the first real inhabitants, Native Americans, how they actually got here to America. Now, there is the quote-unquote, I dubbed it the Moana thesis, based off the very popular Disney movie, that Polynesians did sail across the Pacific Ocean and arrive somewhere in South America, in modern-day Chile and Peru. Now, the evidence to this would be, if you ever watched the movie Moana, they were wayfinders. They could sail across the vast ocean. And if you took any kind of world history course or Chinese history course, you would know that the Chinese, long before the Europeans, had bigger, larger, better ships. And Admiral Hay, he actually would sail from China prior to 1492, and there are some historians, archaeologists that will believe that he may have reached the coast of California, or the evidence comes from down in South America, where if you think about the Easter Island and those large heads, how did they get here? Where did those people come from? And there are some who will argue that perhaps they came from the islands of Polynesia, i.e. Moana thesis. However, the most commonly accepted way people have gotten to Americas comes from the land bridge known as Beringia. Now, this argument says that somewhere between 13 and 20,000 years ago, and this is general consensus, this is what most textbooks say, somewhere between 13 and 20,000 years ago, people began to migrate across a land bridge. Now, 13 to 20,000 years, this is the Ice Age period. And basically, as this theory and archaeological excavations have founded, that during the Ice Age, there was a land bridge that we call Beringia that connected modern-day Siberia, Russia, to modern-day Alaska. And this land bridge that existed back then, the idea was that small groups of hunter-gatherer societies, usually traveling about 25 to 50 people, they begin to follow the migration of large mammals. Again, this is their source of food, their source of clothing, their source of tools, their very source of existence. And these small hunter-gatherer groups began to migrate with these large mammals as they began to migrate across Asia into Russia, and then finally they began to migrate over the Beringia land bridge down through Alaska, follow the coast down as you see the arrows, down through Canada into the United States, eventually further going south into better weather into Mexico in modern day South America. And these are not fast-moving deer, they're following the mammoths. They're following these large, slow-moving animals. In other words, this is not happening over the course of a year. This is not that happening over the course of 100. This is thousands of years of migration here. And they continue moving down until they eventually will meet into the South America. Now, based on where they live, they will begin to develop their own strategies, their own subsistence strategies, how they feed themselves, how they clothe themselves, how they live, their own personal cultural traits, their own personal religions. And again, this is all based on their environment, their geography. Next, this is not just, again, a few people come and we have a vast uninhabited wilderness. No, they begin to repopulate, they begin to form cities and massive civilizations. They begin to spread all throughout North and South America. And what we find is, by the time Columbus does sail the ocean blue in 1492, there are approximately 100 million Native Americans living in the Western Hemisphere. Now, maybe that number doesn't mean much to you. It's a lot of people, yes, but what is that in context? In context, to put it a different way, Native Americans in the Americas, it is estimated they comprised 1/5 of the world's total population in circa 1490. 20% of the world's population was in the Western Hemisphere. And as you can see by my map of just the United States here, this is not, let me repeat, this is not a vast uninhabited wilderness. And like I said, depending on where they lived, each will develop their own unique culture, their own unique social system, and their own unique religion and cultural practice subsistence. Let's examine a few of these. I want you to understand the complexity that, again, there's no such thing as an Indian in 1492. For example, each one has their own creation story, much like the people of Europe did if you go back, pre-Christian days. Each group in Europe had their own creation story of how they got there. And of course, Christians came in, they have their own creation story along with Judaism and Islam. You go over into China, they have their own versions of creation stories. But here in the Americas, there were a number of creation stories. I'm going to go through a few of them really quick, just so you can see their complexity and depth. The first one is based off this painting in 1936. Now again, not that obviously 1936 is not when it took place, but this is the representation of a Seneca Native American tradition. It's known as Sky Woman. Now, according to Seneca tradition, there was originally one man and one woman who lived above the earth in what was called the Sky Dome. Now, the Sky Dome was just one part of a multi-world setting. Now, at one point, Sky Woman's husband confronts his wife because he believes she has committed adultery. Now, how does he figure this? Well, she's pregnant, and he's not the father. Yeah, this actually happens. So we have what's called Immaculate Conception here. It should sound familiar if you're familiar with Judeo-Christian ideas. We have a husband and wife. The wife becomes pregnant, but the husband is not the father of the child. Now, in this story, though, the husband becomes so angry. He uproots the tree of life. You see picture at the top of the painting. And he casts the woman through the hole, who he believes has committed adultery. Now, again, to go back to Judeo-Christian iconography, again, the tree of life in the Garden of Eden in the Judeo-Christian sense, here the tree of life in this garden. He uproots it, he throws the woman down the hole into this earth below. Now, in many Native American traditions, the world was covered in water, which again makes sense if you were a coastal Indian society and realize that the majority of the earth is covered in water. And so what happens is, as the sky woman plummets to the earth, into the ocean below, presumably to her death, because she is innocent, because it was immaculate conception, the birds of the air will catch her on the way down and gently lower her down onto the back of a turtle. Now, the turtle is a very important concept because Native Americans believed that the earth was essentially like slow-moving tortoises. Now, usually when I say this in class, I immediately have students start to giggle like, really? They actually believe this? But if you think about it, it's not that strange, really. Think about it. Nowadays, with modern science and archaeology and modern standards, we have discovered that the earth that we live on is not a solid piece of earth, but rather we live on plates, plate tectonic theory. And of course, if you live out west in California, you know very well about this, as when the plates shift, you get earthquakes. Well, Indians believe that essentially these large plates that the earth was made of, but they believed it was the back of a tortoise shell who were slowly moving their way through the earth. So Sky Woman is cast down. She's gently lowered upon the back of the turtle. Along with her comes some of the dirt from the sky dome above that will begin, and on the back of this turtle shell begins the birth of the land on which the Seneca would live. She will give birth to her immaculate concepted child, and from there, all descendants of the Seneca come from this Sky Woman who will eventually form the entire human race. Again, you can see this is a lot of Indian studies, but you also see a lot of familiar themes with, if you were familiar with the Bible or from Sunday school, the creation stories of the Bible. Again, this is just one story. Another very prominent story, which is really cool, is the Mayan story, and is known as the Popol Vuh. Now, as you see on the screen now, I have the video of this from YouTube. I'm going to show you a short clip from this. Now, as you see, this is part 2 of 7. I actually watched the entire thing. It's very cool. What they did was they recreated the entire story from shards of pottery found in Mayan territories. And they then animated it and have a voiceover to kind of talk about what's happening. It's really cool to watch. Now, I'm going to show you just a couple of minutes of this one. It's about 8 minutes total long, but we're going to watch a couple of minutes of this. So just sit back and relax for a minute and just watch this video. And again, not only understand what they believe, but also look for some familiar iconography.
Sacrifice.
Again, there's betrayal. They cut the head off.
One hunter's head was hung in a dead and barren tree. Instantly, that tree came to life, sprouting scowls and gourds and blossoms. It was forbidden to go near that tree.
Tree of life, tree of good and evil, forbidden fruit.
Fruits. At the same time, there lived a maiden, Little Blood. She heard the story of the miraculous tree, told her by her father, Blood Chief, a lord of Xibalba.
Xibalba is more of a
God-like
god-like place.
Go and see this tree. Its fruit is said to be truly delicious.
And so she went, all by herself, to the tree.
Will I die? Will I be lost if I pick just one?
You don't want this fruit. This is not fruit at all, but a skull that has turned around on the branches of a tree.
I do want it.
Then stretch out your hand. I have given you a sign. This head of mine does not work anymore. When a man dies, people get frightened by the bones. But one's essence is not lost. It remains whole and lives in one's sons and daughters. This I have given you, little blood. Climb up to earth. Do not be afraid. You shall not die, for in you my sons will live.
And again, you can see very quickly there's the tree of the forbidden fruit, there's the tree of life. You have this one woman, presumably a virgin, or in this case an Eve character, who comes and eats the fruit. They get a slight variation on the Bible story of the Garden of Eden, but she eats the fruit, and then the tree says she surely will not die, but she will go to earth and become basically the mother of all creation. And now if the video goes on, you will see she will also, very similar, she will have an immaculate conception. And again, you see the very similar trend here. And if you ever get a chance, take your time, watch these videos. They're fascinating to understand and watch. And again, these are the only stories. There's one more, just for fun, we want to talk about. And that, of course, is something I alluded to at the very beginning of this lecture, and that, of course, is Moana. Now, while fictitious, there is some basis of historical fact here. And it is, for those of you who've seen the movie, a very powerful visual representation of a native creation story. Now, of course, if you've seen the movie, the very beginning, Grandma Thala is recapping kind of the history of why things are the way they are, how Maui lost his fish hook by stealing the heart of Te Fiti. And of course, you have the gods Te Fiti and Tekau, which are one and the same, spoiler alert. And of course, during the movie, you have the very fun, whimsical song of You're Welcome, as Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson sings what Maui has done for Earth's people as a demigod. And of course, very famously, he caught an eel, buried its guts, outsprang a tree, and now you have coconuts. And again, it's fictitious. It's silly in many ways. But it is a powerful visual representation of just how diverse native cultures were. Now again, I've just given you 2.5 stories here. Sky Woman, the Popol Vuh, and of course, the Polynesian story, fictitious, of Moana's people. The thing is, again, this is diversity. The thing is, it wasn't just in religion. It was also in things like language. It is estimated that when Columbus arrives in America, note again, he's not discovering America, he arrives here, that there are as many as 1,000 different language groups in the Americas, 250 different languages just in North America. And you can see by the map on the screen, there's no homogeneity. There is no homogeneous Indian culture. There is diversity of language. There's diversity of religion. There's also diversity of housing. And again, this goes back to the idea that Native Americans adapted to the environment in which they lived. Again, if you live in the Southwest, the bottom right corner, you're not going to be building a house out of sticks. If you've been to the American Southwest, it's dry. There are very few trees. Unless you want to build your house out of a cactus with lots of spikes sticking through your butt all night, it's not going to be a pleasant experience. So they use adobe. They use mud, which coincidentally also keeps them a little bit cooler in the hot, hot summers. As the mud dries, it hardens almost like rock, and it protects them and gives them a nice sturdy dwelling with open windows to allow the breeze to come through. However, look at the bottom left in the Great Plains. This is what we normally think of when we think Indian, right? This is what you're taught as a kid. Indians live in teepees. Well, if you live in the Great Plains, you did, because in the Great Plains of the United States, there was not a ton of trees. There's a lot of open spaces. And when they did find trees, they would use the long poles to make teepees. And of course, they made also how teepee was made out of the bones of buffalo. The buffalo hide was used for the teepee canvas cover. And what made these particularly important is the Native Americans living in the Great Plains often had to move with the seasons to follow their food source, the buffalo, which means they need something that's portable. And of course, teepees, as you might know, are quite portable. And a teepee can be folded up and carried around so they can move from camp to follow their food source, or based on the season. Now, teepees are cool because the hole in the top allows them to actually have fires in the middle and the inside of them so they can keep warm all night but not suffocate from carbon monoxide poisoning, smoke. Now, on the East Coast, on your top right, there's a lot more trees. And you have a lot cooler climate in the wintertime. Therefore, you need something that you can build to keep you warm, keep the cold wind out. And of course, use these small brush-like hutches, these wigwams as they're known, versus the Northeast where you have these towering trees. You have this much colder weather. And so they build these longhouses as not only for their personal dwellings, but as corporate communal spaces that are easily good for defense. They're good for meeting spaces, they're good for religious purposes, and again, for keeping the cold out and for storage of food, corn, during the winter months. So these are just 4 examples. But we have diversity of religion, we have diversity of language, and now here we have diversity of dwelling. And again, these are all based on regionalization, based on the environment in which they lived. Now, while there are a number of differences, there are some similar characteristics between Native American tribes. And one of it, while their creation stories are very different, very unique, even though some overlap, one thing they do share is a common religious belief that scholars, anthropologists refer to as what's called animism. Now, animism, you would say, is the religion of Native American culture. Now, while the stories themselves are unique, there are some very common similarities that we have not discussed as yet. For example, most all creation stories emphasize the importance of animals as part of their survival. Animals mean food, they mean, often drink purposes, they help find new areas. Some animals can provide, labor sources, especially further south. But you see then that animals figure prominently. Remember Sky Woman. They had the turtle. They had the birds that saved the Sky Woman. Even in the Popol Vuh, you'll see a number of animals, and you notice that the names of the characters were based on animals. Why is that? Because they believe in this concept known as animism. And now, animism does not mean tree hugger. It is not some new age religion. Animism is the belief system in which people believe that everything has a spirit. People have spirits. Animals have spirits. Plants, the sun, the water, the wind, etc. Everything around us has a spirit. And therefore, the way in which Native Americans would interact with nature, the way they would perform their rituals, perform their religious beliefs, they were characterized in the way in which they would interact with the elements of nature, with the spirits of the things around them. Now remember, this is not everyone sings Kumbaya and lives perfect harmony. No, they're not tree hugger, peace with nature things type of people thinking. No. The idea is that you want to remain in balance with your environment. They are often fearful of their environment because they want to manipulate the environment in specific ways in order for their benefit and also not for their detriment. Because the fear is if they do something to offend those spirits, that they will in turn cause some kind of curse or bad they can come upon them, like a hurricane or a flood or a tornado or an earthquake. These are all things that could be a negative result of not interacting properly with the environment. Now, I'm going to talk about a couple of quick examples that might trigger your thought process. The first one, of course, go back to my Disney references, Pocahontas. And we'll talk more about Pocahontas later. But Grandmother Willow, the idea that the willow tree has a spirit that can speak to the living and provide wisdom. This is an idea of animism. Probably the better example, if you've ever seen Avatar. Now I'm talking James Cameron Avatar with the big blue people, where they go to the land of Pandora searching for the metal unobtainium, not The Last Airbender. And again, I'm going to assume for a moment you've at least heard of it and or seen it. It is the third now highest grossing movie in history. Now, if you remember that story very well, in the movie at all, you'll remember how when they would kill an animal, they would do a little ritual and say, basically, thank you for the animal given their life, they could live, knowing full well that when they die, they will go back to the earth to become food for the animal. And if you remember all the electrical currents and the little things floating through the air, and then they finally go to their tree of life and talk to their god, Iowa, the idea that everything is connected through this electrical current. Like the synapses in a brain, as the movie said. But that everything, all these various spirits are all connected. Or if you want to be a little more back to my Disney references, which technically Avatar is a Disney movie now, owned by Disney. Think about Circle of Life in Lion King. Yes, lions eat, the antelope, but then the lions die and the antelope eat the grass, which now contain from the fertilizer of the dead lions. The circle of life. Again, that everything exists in a balance. This is what animism is. Now, as I mentioned, though, part of that is knowing how to manipulate the environment in very specific ways and knowing the proper way in which to do so, the proper procedure, the proper ritual. And that fell upon the head or the shoulders of a religious leader known as a shaman. So, in Indian societies, there were military leaders, there were chiefs, so political leaders, there were diplomatic leaders, and of course, there were also religious leaders known as shaman. Now, the interesting part about shaman is that they were often chosen very specifically. It was not usually hereditary. Well, at least not passed on from generation to generation, but rather the shaman was chosen often because of a physical deformity. As in, they were born blind. They were born without, say, an arm or a leg. They were born as a dwarf. The idea was, and it sounds strange, and most students actually laugh when I say this, but it actually makes a lot of sense. Because the thought process was, if a person is born with a physical deformity, maybe even mental deformity, but mostly physical deformity, they were born deaf, for instance. We've heard the idea, I'm sure you've all heard it, that we have our 5 senses. If one of them goes out, we lose one of our senses, the other ones become heightened to try to compensate for it. So if you go blind, maybe your sense of hearing and smell are a little more heightened so that you can perceive the things around you in the world. And so the thought for Native American societies was, this person was born blind. This person was born deaf. Well, maybe then, while that sense of theirs has been diminished or gone, is not there, maybe their other senses now are more in tune with the spirit realm. And so the idea of a shaman then was to, again, manipulate and communicate with the spirit realm in order to, again, manipulate it with rituals, procedures, and practices that would get the desired result. Make a good harvest season, create a good hunt, and protect against unwanted danger, as in hurricane, earthquake, flood, losing in war. And what this does, though, is this gives shamans great amounts of power. They have a tremendous responsibility, though, to the welfare of the people. If famine or pestilence or war overtakes a people, yeah, they're afforded great privileges in society, the shaman is. But what if something bad happens? What if a hurricane comes through? Or what if a flood? Or what if they lose through to a neighboring tribe in warfare? Who's to blame for that? The shaman is. And so often, while they share tremendous responsibility, they share tremendous privilege in their society, their higher up echelon, they will also share a very real burden. Because if you start to have some problems in your society, the first person to blame is the shaman. Now, to put it in sports terms, you can't fire the players, you fire the coach. Well, unfortunately for the shaman, it wasn't just getting fired, it was execution. If you're lucky, banishment, usually execution. And hey, who's up next? Who's the next shaman? So this is something that almost all Native American societies had in their societies, a shaman. Now, of course, the real big issue is when things go really wrong, as in European arrival. The shaman is expected to fix the problem. And the European arrival puts tremendous pressure on shamans. And when they fail, because they are going to fail, they will often be the first to be killed. Now, moving on from shaman, women also were a very similar position in most Native American societies. Now, not all, but again, speaking more generalized here. Women, while very few times will they ever be chief or leader, they will, in most societies, hold a great deal of power. Even though they will not hold the actual leadership position, they will be afforded the respect that often the next chief will come from the woman's bloodline, not the man's. So they don't care about the man's lineage, they care about the woman's lineage. In addition, they will often have a tremendous amount of say, voting, political sway when it comes to choosing the next chief. And as we'll get to in a few minutes about subsistence strategies, women will be the ones who provide the bulk of calories on a daily basis for the tribe. And because of their tremendous, benefit to their society, they're providing the bulk, the vast majority of the calories. Women are afforded a greater role, again, a greater equality. Now, I'm not saying they're over men, but there was tremendous, in most Native American cultures, there was tremendous equality. Yes, they performed different tasks, they performed a different job, but different did not mean unequal. Different just meant, hey, we each do our contributing part to society, and we all take part equally. And so there are some similarities here with animism, with the role of women. And there are also some similarities when it came to subsistence strategies. Now, subsistence, of course, is how you live, how you get your food so that your society can live and grow. Now, early on, as I mentioned very early on, we talked about the idea of, I said hunter-gatherers. So what are hunter-gatherers? Well, it's just like what it sounds like. See, hunter-gatherers, they use their wide variety of resources very effectively from what's around them. And what they do is the men go out and hunt for large wild game, which is again why we talked about the Beringia, Bering Straits, and the migration down the western coast. The men go out and hunt for big game, which is considered a source of pride when you bring home, the big game. It provides a tremendous amount of meat and protein and calories. However, men, more often than not, are not successful in their endeavor. Rather, the bulk of the calories come from women. The women stay home while the men go out and hunt. And they gather nuts, berries, and other edible plants. Now, you may think originally, how is this equal? Well, because the women are providing the bulk of the calories, because they are far more successful than the men are, that affords them greater standing. In addition, you might think to yourself, well, how is it fair? Why is it women's work and man's work? It's practical. Not only was maybe the idea men were a little bit stronger, maybe, but practically speaking, think of what women did here. Women had tremendous knowledge, expertise. I mean, men go hunt an animal, go hunt a mammoth. Okay, great. They know if they kill that mammoth, there's gonna be lots of good food there. Fantastic. They'll cook it, they'll eat it. When you go out, if you go outside, you see a berry bush. Do you know whether or not that berry is edible? Does it taste good? Is it poisonous? Because there are poison berries, and I will admit I don't know all the answers, but women knew this. The women in Native American society knew which plants to eat and which ones not to eat, which berries to eat, which ones not to eat, which ones were good for food, nutrition, ones were not. That's one reason. Women had that expertise passed from generation to generation. Again, back to the question, why women stayed home, not why don't they go hunt? Well, the reality is we can't think of Native American women like we do our modern women. Now, not to try to burst any bubbles here, but when you're born, the vast majority of all babies, especially back then, were breastfed babies. Now, I can tell you, because I've had 2 children in the last 5 years, that the American Pediatric Association recommends that women breastfeed, the mothers breastfeed their babies at least 6 months. Get to a year, that's amazing, you're an awesome mom. That's kind of the standard when it comes to the American Association, Pediatric Association. Fantastic. Native American women would often breastfeed their kids for 5 years. 5 years. Which means they probably have 3 kids breastfeeding all at one time. And it makes it very difficult to lug 3 kids hanging off you while they're trying to breastfeed, or have to stop and breastfeed 2 or 3 different kids and try to go hunt big game. So rather than trying to lug these kids out in the middle of the wilderness trying to hunt, large animals, women's made it much easier to stick around the camp and begin, be able to pick nuts and berries while still maintaining, their food supply for their children to make them healthier. Again, children can survive on breast milk for years without having other kinds of food because the woman's body will produce it, what they need naturally. So again, why women are afforded this equality within society. Now, on your screen, maybe you're wondering, what in the world? Why do you have a picture of corn here? Well, beyond hunters and gatherers, the problem with hunting and gathering is it can only sustain a group of somewhere between 20 and 30 people. And because when you're moving so constantly with the food sources available, your food source, hunting and gathering, will only sustain usually 20 to 30 people. Sometimes you get to that 50-person mark occasionally, but usually it's fairly small numbers. In order to grow a larger society, you need a more stable, sustainable food source. And this is where we call sedentary or semi-sedentary living, or a semi-sedentary subsistence strategy. Now, alliteration aside, it's a fancy way of saying they grew domesticated crops. And the big holy trinity of crops in Native America were beans, corn, and squash. Now, the reason these 3 grow so well together was if you look at the kind of your top right of your screen, you see the modern day corn stalk there. And beans, squash, and corn grow really well because each one can grow underneath at a different level than the other one. So the corn stalk provides shade and provides cover for the squash, which provides cover for the beans, and the beans provide nitrates into the soil, and they work in a very symbiotic relationship. They can all essentially grow from the same whole, the Holy Trinity for Native Americans. Now, I want you to know, Native Americans, when they arrived back, whether it was 13, 20,000 years ago, there was no corn as you see on the right of your screen. No, not at all. In fact, what there was is what you see on the far left of your screen, that tiny little thing known as an ear of corn. And the way they're able to get from that tiny little ear of corn to that huge ear of corn you buy at HEB, 10 for $1, and put slather butter on, or if you are like me, you grill it on the grill, slather it with some mayonnaise, add a little cojita or crumbling Mexican cheese to it, and of course a little hot sauce too as well, and have some elote. Or if you really want to get fun, put it in a cup and have some corn in the cup. How do you get from there to there? It's the process known as domestication. And so, now again, domestication is just a fancy word for the process by which humans modify plants and animals to enhance characteristics that humans desire. In other words, you take that tiny little ear and someone says, that tastes pretty good one day. So they take the biggest, juiciest tiny ear they can find and they replant those seeds. And then when that plant grows the following year, they take the biggest, juiciest, slightly 1 millimeter bigger ear they can find, they replant that one. And then the following year, they do it again. This is another maybe we got 2 millimeters this year. Let's take this juicy ear of corn, let's replant the seeds and grow it again. And through a process of selective breeding, they continually choose the largest, juiciest ear of corn to replant until finally, over hundreds of years, we will finally get from that tiny little ear that, is barely a snack for my 1-year-old to the juicy ear of corn that you all know and love and want to roast right now and put with some mayonnaise. A little bit of lime juice too as well. And of course, who did this responsibility fall on? With the exception of the American Southwest, most crops were grown by the women. Again, men went out to hunt the bigger game, and women stayed at home when they weren't hunting and gathering now because they were sedentary, staying in one place, or they would move between 3 or 4 places total in a year. Slightly summer, winter, fall, summer camps. The women would be the ones who would be doing the farming. They would hoe the fields, they would plant the corn, they would tend the crops, they would harvest the crops. Again, women are providing the bulk of the calories. So when we move from hunter-gatherer to sedentary, women still are afforded a great degree of equality. The one exception being the American Southwest, where farming is very difficult, the ground is a lot harder, and there it was actually considered man's work to do the farming. But everywhere else, women's work was for the farming. Now I want to stop for a minute here because this also brings up another important point. I'm sure you've all heard the idea that America was a virgin land. I'm sure you heard that back in 8th grade or when you took history class in the past. And again, the idea that America was a virgin land is really a propaganda myth of the Europeans. Because the idea of a virgin land was that Native Americans didn't really do anything. They just kind of lived there and sang Kumbaya as tree huggers. They didn't want to touch or affect or change or manipulate, modify the land. But the reality is, as you can see by the screenshot or this picture on your screen right now, they did manipulate the land, big time. They cut down trees to build their wigwams or longhouses or fashion the mud into adobe. They took weeds. I mean, if you look at that first picture on the right picture with that first picture of a corn stalk, that's not a corn, that's a weed. In fact, there's a definition of weeds. You know what a real definition of a weed is? A weed is a, quote, plant whose use to humanity has not yet been discovered, unquote. In other words, we just haven't found a use for it yet. I'm sure many of you listening to this video probably have your yards sprayed and fertilized. Either you do it yourself, maybe your parents make you do it, or you have someone like TruGreen come and do it. And of course, the goal is to get weeds out of your yard, especially those pesky dandelions. But are dandelions really weeds? Well, they are in your yard because you don't want them there. But anybody ever had dandelion tea? It's actually quite delicious. And so A weed is just something that you as a person don't want there or don't have a good use for yet. And Indians, Native Americans, were able to take these so-called weeds, the corn stalk you see in the kind of middle of your screen right now, and through a process of domestication, manipulate it, change it to the modern ear of corn we know and love today. And thus we say is now domesticated. Now, there are some really important things when it comes to sedentary life. On the one hand, it creates large societies, the ability to have large societies, because you have a stable food source. The animals aren't constantly moving. You can grow more crops. All you need is more land and more people to work it. You can grow more crops, and therefore you can have larger societies. And again, if you've ever taken world history, this is something you should have studied already. It also not only allows for larger populations. I'm talking not from now 50, I'm talking to tens of thousands of people living in a city, all because you're able to grow your own crops. You also get to have more elaborate societies and cultures, a little more comfort. You can have textiles, you can have ceramic pottery. I mean, pots are great, but if you're constantly moving with the herds every few weeks or every couple months, do you really want a beautiful, ornate, well-crafted vase sitting in your tent that you have to carry with you to the next place where the animals are moving? No, it's not practical. But once you settle down and stay in one place for, again, most of the year, if not all year round, now you start creating things like blankets and elaborate textiles and pottery and ceramics and other jewelry and trinkets that you find valuable. That's the positive side of things, materialism, if you call materialism positive. There are also some negative things, though, specifically health problems. First and foremost, because you are reliant on basically a single crop. Now, you might grow three things like, corn, squash, and beans, but you're reliant upon the soil in that area, which can become exhausted over time and give you less yield. You're susceptible to drought or flooding, hurricanes. We know that well here in Houston. You're also more vulnerable to gastrointestinal infections. If there's a problem with the crops where certain types of bugs get on them and you eat them, they can cause you tremendous gastrointestinal issues. This also leads to infections, epidemics, which is something we all know well in 2020. It also creates the need for more children. So you have population boom, thus a bigger society. But you need for more children because you need more workers in the fields, but there also is a higher mortality rate, which means you need more children to repopulate those who are lost. You have to work harder, which also, between that and the epidemics, the infections, the gastrointestinal issues, the problems with you're lacking certain vitamins and nutrients because you're relying upon one crop, you end up having shorter lifespans as a result. And you also create a stratified society where women are not necessarily equal anymore. Instead, you have much more a class hierarchy system. And eventually, we will get to the point where we have full sedentary societies. Again, this takes place over thousands of years, from hunter-gatherers to semi-sedentary to full sedentary societies. And once we do this, we are able to free Native American men and women from precarious nomadic lives. This will be the agricultural revolution that will transpire both in Europe and in the Americas. Now, the majority of our large sedentary civilizations will be in Central and South America. But there will be some in North America as well, in what is now the United States. Please note what this says, though. Native Americans, they grew surplus crops. They manipulated the environment to do so. They had specialized labor. They lived in cities and societies that were very hierarchical, in terms of social organization. Very similar to Europe. Some Native American societies were every bit as sophisticated as those in Europe. And those are some we'll talk about in the second half of this lecture. So for now, we'll stop here. When we come back for part B of this lecture, we will discuss these large civilizations in the Americas prior to European contact. But until next time, take care and bye-bye.